Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to a post on why I dislike pop science and sci-comm, otherwise known as popular science and scientific communication. It's a whole industry, and it's used to recruit people to become scientists, and I like to question what they're really attempting to achieve. Today's dominant media narrative laments how stupid and anti-science a large fraction of the American public is. The narrative is that they are so uneducated that they will inject bleach into their veins while refusing vaccines. They are so naive that they believe in creationism instead of evolution. This is the narrative with which I grew up in the American Midwest, and I know why it doesn't stick to a lot of people. To the Bible Belt audience they've been trying to convert, popular scientists look like idiots, and those who try to shame their neighbors into getting educated look like arrogant group thinkers. So this might shock some people when they realize that this means that your hero, Bill Nye the Science Guy, looked like a silly Chicken Little when he went on a talk show to debate a climate science denier. And when you repeated his talking points, you looked kind of silly too. This isn't about climate science. This is about the mantra that gets repeated in the popular media of trust the scientists, trust the scientists. You shouldn't always trust the scientists. They're not always right. In fact, they're very often wrong. Yes, you should wear a mask, not because scientists told you to wear a mask for the coronavirus, but because it just makes sense, because it's common sense. So yeah, that's, I think, the real message that I would like to promote is that we should all do our own thinking and exercise our common sense. And it makes a lot of sense to cover your mouth if you don't want to spread germs in a time when there are some dangerous germs around. You don't need a scientist to tell you that. And it really irritates me when people go around saying, science says you have to do this. No, common sense says that. And there is some good science that's done, but there's also a lot of bad science. So using science as a bully pulpit to get people to do things, I think this has got to stop. It's just nonsense. What I know for sure is that there are a lot of smart people out there to whom the educational system did not stick. Maybe they learned the lessons and got the grades, but they didn't buy the narrative. Maybe they paid more attention to what was not being taught than what was being taught. Some people habitually see other ways to explain things, and they feel disturbed to be surrounded by so many people who have been brainwashed into accepting a single narrative. Some of these people are nostalgic for a more no-nonsense presentation style. One that's not so manic and full of showy, clownish, attention-grabbing gimmicks. One way that certain people avoid brainwashing is by being too distracted by pain to absorb what is being taught. There are a lot of students today who have difficult, painful lives, and you can label them as ignorant, or you can view them as independent thinkers. And I think it's important to remember that independent thinkers often play a vital role in keeping a community grounded when it loses its head in the clouds. Just think of But of course, all of these independent thinkers end up as martyrs. Think of Socrates, Jesus. Think of Pythagoras. So Pythagoras is famous for understanding a lot of interesting things about triangles. But he was also, I think, a vegetarian, and he had formed kind of a cult-like group around him who listened to him and wanted to learn from him. But he told his local town not to eat fava beans because they were dangerous. And most of the people, they would eat the fava beans and they'd say, "This is nonsense. Fava beans are not poisonous." But they were actually wrong. For a subset of people, especially children, fava beans are deadly toxic. It's just some people don't have the right chemicals to process a toxin in the fava beans, but most people do. And he was telling people, don't eat fava beans, because he'd noticed this correlation. But the townspeople were angry with him for having pointed this out, because they wanted to eat fava beans and it hadn't hurt them before. So, I mean, this is a classic example of a scientist being ignored by people, but it can also happen the other way around, where you've got people all saying, trust the science, when you've got someone who isn't a scientist saying, the scientists are saying something weird, you know? This is just where people have to use their own senses and thinking ability to reground themselves. So you can see that I am kind of on a mission to undermine a lot of popular science narratives and the idea that you just have to point to the science and then you'll be right, because that's just not true. And that's why I'm going to give you a somewhat unhinged review of a few popular science books. So maybe I'll go into some sort of unhinged character. The first book is called Infinity in the Palm of Your Hand: 50 Wonders That Reveal an Extraordinary Universe. It's by Marcus Chown. And this is the sort of book that makes me want to throw things and then burn them and then throw them again as they burn. Stop trying so hard to be interesting and charming. You are not interesting or charming. You look like a stupid clown, and your fun facts sound dumb because all you've learned how to do in school is make simple things sound more complicated than they really are. All you have learned to do as a pop scientist is to act like a manic moron and conflate things in useless ways that only seem surprising to idiots. This is not what education should be all about. In Chapter 3, you wrote that babies are powered by rocket fuel. Come on! This is practically a satire of popular science writing. Your chipper, conversational tone is obnoxious. And your stories about the famous lone geniuses from the past are just bullshit, made up to motivate gullible children. That isn't how human knowledge actually progresses. Knowledge is created and destroyed by a far more collective process, driven by group dynamics and money. Lots of money. Stop your Pied Piper piping and heroic narratives and let people remember how to describe what they see in regular words. In time, your bullshit jargon will be exposed for the useless nonsense that it is. Your emperors have no clothes. Your book says a million things while teaching people nothing. Sometimes I think that the stupidest ideas are the ones given to popular scientists to spread about like so much manure. It is a way of keeping actual knowledge for an elite few. Luckily, that manure tends to turn to compost, and some seeds will grow eventually, as long as they are not smothered with another shovelful of manure. If the stupid pop scientists would just shut the hell up, people might actually learn something one of these days. That brings me to my next pop science book. It's called What Do You Think You Are? The Science of What Makes You, You, by Brian Clegg. This book was written by an older author with a long career as a pop scientist. He has literally written hundreds of pop science books, even though he never had a career as a scientist. So I'm trying to distinguish here between people who are doing real work, who are trying to think critically about things, and then the science popularizers, who are often full of it. Okay, so this guy, he was educated at Oxford or Cambridge or something, and he worked at an airline for a little while. And you might wonder, why did he become a pop scientist? As far as I could tell, he was just a guy who wanted to have a career as a professional know-it-all, and due to his school connections, he knew the sorts of publishers that could help him make that dream a reality. What would cause a person to choose such a career? In his case, perhaps it was regret about his chosen career as an airline accountant, and a hostility towards religion after encountering some creepy, predatory pastors in his youth. I am, of course, speculating here. In any case, he doesn't seem like a people person, and writing books is an ideal career for a loner. But is he evangelizing for the religion of scientism because it does not require the worshiper to think about people at all? If you reduce a person to a collection of particles, maybe that takes away the pain of existence. I have some sympathy for this man who has mistaken pop science and puzzles for wisdom, but that doesn't mean that I like the science evangelism books he's written. I think that kids deserve a less blinkered, more philosophically balanced perspective. Next up is a book written by an actual physics academic. Something Deeply Hidden by Sean Carroll. Quantum Worlds and the Emergence of Space-Time. His crimes against basic sense are even worse because he should know better. He's a physics professor after all, and since 2012 he has written 10 popular science books that all promote the quasi-religious idea that wonder, truth, meaning, and beauty can be found through the search for practically unmeasurable particles. I agree with Carroll's thesis that quantum mechanics is taught badly and that entanglement is especially badly taught, although I don't think that he does a very good job himself. The promotional materials describe a hardline many worlds interpretation in which there are an infinite number of Sean Carrolls existing in an infinite number of other universes. Carroll himself tweeted, "Once you admit that an electron can be in a superposition of different locations, it follows that person can be in a superposition of having seen the electron in different locations, and indeed that reality as a whole can be in a superposition, and it becomes natural to treat every term in that superposition as a separate world." It does not follow. It does not follow at all. I think Carroll's interpretation is ridiculous because the many worlds interpretation of particle mechanics does not apply to macroscopic objects. People are not particles. I am never in a superposition of states with another version of myself. I am in a single state, and just because I can imagine other states doesn't mean that they exist. Just because I can't ever fully describe or know the state that I am in does not mean that I do not exist with a defined state. Carol might ask, what is this I about which you are so concerned? There are many I's, and they may be in disagreement until an action occurs that represents the majority opinion. I would answer that I am the majority opinion. I am what I do and what I decide. I am what I think, and that may oscillate from moment to moment when I am undecided, but it is not necessarily in a superposition of states. It frustrates me to no end when someone takes a theory meant to figuratively describe fundamental particles and they apply it literally to people or trains and tunnels, as in relativity. Of course, we are in disagreement because he is thinking about what is happening over the course of a time step, and I am thinking about what is happening in the instant between the time steps. It's the difference between relativistic and Cartesian thinking. A person who had taken Philosophy 101 might counter that if I exist with a defined state, this leads down a slippery slope to Solipsism, the idea that I could just be a brain in a box being manipulated by an evil demon. To avoid this, we need to make sure that there is a way for objective reality to leak into my brain in a box. And that leakiness is described by quantum uncertainty, which is not necessarily the same thing as existence in a superposition of states. If I can't fully know the state that I am in, then I infer that there must be something intrinsically random preventing me from knowing that state, and the existence of that intrinsically random something prevents solipsism, because something that is intrinsically random can't be an evil demon, because randomness is the opposite of consciousness. So, for more on this and to hear Sean Carroll's side of the story, there's a video and some more links in the blog post below. I encourage you to head down that rabbit hole. So, but to wrap this up, just because it is possible for there to be a world in which a matrix-like evil demon controls all of your sensory input, this does not mean that this possibility is likely. In fact, it's highly unlikely due to the randomness we see around us. A matrix would have, or a parallel world controlled thing, would have a hard time maintaining randomness while maintaining consciousness. I bet there is a mathematical proof of that somewhere, but sometimes chalk is cheaper than gray matter, and I think this might be one of those instances. Back to Carol, a man whose only crime is allowing himself to become a pop scientist. A despicable lot. The many world story is nothing new. It made the rounds back in the 1960s, and my guess is that publishers are looking to make a quick buck off of presenting an old, untestable, garbage conjecture as the new fashion. In my opinion, if you can build a science fiction story around it, it is garbage. And that's sort of one of the points I make in that's something I try to express in my fiction. I've written science fiction stories about silly ideas in physics to try to show how silly they are, rather than try to make you believe that the world works that way, as is common in other science fiction. Next up is a pop science book written by a science journalist, and it was given very bad reviews by people within the scientific community. I haven't read it, but I have read a few of the author's blog posts on Scientific American, and I think there's definitely some valuable insight to be found there. It's The End of Science by John Horgan, facing the limits of knowledge in the twilight of the scientific age. And I'm a little concerned that his blog on Scientific American has been ended. They're taking all of these blogs that had a lot of really interesting kind of apostatic perspectives on a lot of the sacred cows of physics, and they're ending them and they're corralling them in a new location, which I think is that's a pity. A newer face on the apostatic physics scene is that of Sabine Hosenfelder. She criticizes theoretical physics while paying respect to experimental physics, and while I appreciate her effort, I find her perspective a bit blinkered. Her book was called Lost in Math: How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. She is respectful of the experimental physics community and critical of the theoretical physics community because her training was in theoretical physics. I, in contrast, was trained by the experimental physics community, and I have a much less rosy view of their work than she does. But none of this really gets to the heart of why I am so irritated with pop scientists and scientific communication industry people. The real reason for my ire stems from my understanding of Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat. In The Cat in the Hat, a couple of kids are shoveling snow, and the cat walks into their house and makes a big mess in the bathtub. The kids don't know how to clean it up, but the cat does. He has so many creative ideas. However, after each cleaning operation, the mess just grows and grows until it covers everything everywhere. Oh, the things that they did, and they did them so hard. It was all one big spot now, all over the yard. Then the cat takes an invisible, magical cat named Voom out of his hat, and Voom magically cleans up the mess. This is the story of modern physics. You dig a great big deep hole, black hole of complexity. You climb in, you climb out, and you call that progress. So they make a mess knowing it's a mess when the solution has been simple all along. So pop scientists give us problems we didn't even know we had, involving bizarre objects like neutron stars, gravity waves, and black holes in unimaginably distant galaxies. And these problems have no practical applications. They then recruit workers for wild goose chases, as in busy work for the technically inclined, when all those kids really wanted to do was shovel the snow and go inside to play. But the cat had other plans for them. He wanted, I guess, a standing army of technically inclined people. It's kind of ridiculous, really. So after using this blog post or this video to spew my disgust with the pop science and scientific communication industry, I will conclude by announcing that I'm almost finished editing my pop science books that I've been writing over the past few years. There's a link to a good fraction of one of them. You can read for free on Quora. It's on my profile on Quora under the myths of modern physics, and I'll provide links in the blog post below. So with that, I would like to thank you for listening to this somewhat unhinged rant, but I hope that it gave you a new perspective on things that might have been confusing you. A lot of people step away from reading a popular science book with a sense of confusion, but they know something's wrong. They're just not really sure what it is. And they think that, yeah, it's a big time waste. Thank you for watching. Until next time.